This episode of Brains on Games is about taking over 16th century Japan. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald, and before we get into this episode's game, I just want to let everybody know that we just passed the 2-year anniversary of the Brains on Games channel. So I want to thank everyone who's subscribed or watched or liked or commented on any of those videos. Thanks so much for keeping this thing going. And let's get into this episode's game, which is all about taking over Japan in the 16th century, where samurai are warring to become the shogun. And it is a game that was sent to me just a couple of weeks ago by the designer. It's a game that was up on Kickstarter last year, but now it's available to order, a game called Daimyo Senso. So this is a game that can be played with between 1 and 8 players. So there is a solo mode. Kids 12 and up can figure this one out, and a game plays in about 40 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the number of players. Let's take a deeper look at Daimyo Senso. This game is on a gigantic board that's quite reflective, so hopefully you'll be able to see what's going on here. The board is huge. It takes up my entire table, so I've set it up sideways here, and hopefully, like I said, you'll be able to see most of it. A lot of the rules are printed in the ocean spaces on this board, but the majority of the board is taken up by this giant map of Japan, and you can see everything's divided up into those various provinces. So this is a strategy game, an area control game that's about medium in terms of its complexity. And like I said, kids age 12 and up can figure this one out, maybe even younger kids if they're used to playing games like Risk. It is a lot like Risk with a lot of the randomness removed from it. The point of this game is to score the most honor points by the end of 4 rounds of play. Each round represents a year, and you're going to take 4 actions, 1 action in each season. And there's a couple of different ways. Well, there are lots of different rule sets within the rule book that you can use, some optional rules, but generally, and the way that we played was we used this chart here at the top of the game board, a chart that determines which action each faction will take and the order in which they'll be taken in every year of the game. Now, alternatively, you've got something that came with the game, if I can find it here. You've got these cards. So 4 cards that look like this, and you can play these instead so that you can take your actions in whatever order you want, but it just keeps track of the fact that you get 2 attacks, 1 deploy action where you're putting more soldiers out on the map, and 1 move action where you're moving your pieces around the board without attacking anyone else. So it is an area control game. The actions are either set or you're doing some action selection as you're trying to take over the majority of this map in order to earn more honor points. Most of the information in this game is available to all of the players. You can see which soldiers are on the board. You know which actions a player has left in that year or which actions are coming up, depending on whether you play with the action cards or you use this table. But what you don't know, the hidden information, is really on these 4 cards. Each faction has a unique set of 4 general cards that will allow them to have some bonus on one phase of their turn in the game. You can only play one of these per year, and the game is played over 4 years. So once per year, you can play one of these cards. They do typically become more powerful later in the game because they might be based on the number of cities you control or the number of fortresses or towns. So if you wait until later, they may give you a huge bonus, but if you don't play them in your first year, for example, then one of those cards is going to go to waste because you play 1 per year and the game is played over 4 years. These general cards are based on actual generals from the late 1500s in Japan, people who actually worked for these daimyos who are trying to become shogun. And I found myself looking up, I was Googling and checking out Wikipedia articles about these folks, and some of the powers that they give you in the game are really based on things that happened in this timeline in Japan. So you might get to deploy extra soldiers. You might get to move extra soldiers or move your soldiers further. You may get to do some sort of a surprise attack or make your attacks more powerful. I will tell you that the different cards for the different factions, some are way more powerful than others, but they just add like a crazy element of surprise that's only going to come up in one phase of the game in each year, because you can only play one of those cards per year. So the idea of budgeting those cards and hanging on to them versus playing them right away is an interesting element to the game. And like I said, it does add that surprise to a game where most of the information is available to everyone and there's no randomness to it at all. Once you've done your 2 attacks and your deploy and move actions in the year, that's the end of the year. That's when you start to calculate up those honor points. So you do get that end of round scoring. If you happen to rule an entire province, there might be some additional bonuses that you're able to use. But we did find that hard in a 2-player game. We took over a couple of provinces, but some in the middle we started to battle for them. So it was hard to control a whole province. And certainly in a game with 4 players, that would become even more challenging. What skills are you working on when you play a game of Daimyo Senso? Well, you're doing that action selection, you're planning ahead, you're keeping track of a lot of information, and you're trying to maximize those points. And so if you're planning and budgeting and trying to tackle things in an organized, efficient way, those are all examples of executive functioning skills, the skills and behaviors that you need in order to work towards a goal. If you're lucky enough to have a big group of players and you have to negotiate and be diplomatic with your opponents, then you're exercising some social skills as well. I like games where you have to make deals with other players. So exercising that diplomatic ability, trying to make deals, especially when you're working with opponents. This is not a cooperative game. And that requires players to kind of have mixed feelings about these other players. Can you trust that other player? Are they going to take advantage of you? Say they're going to do one thing and then do something totally different. So there are some social skills involved when you're playing a game that involves that kind of diplomacy. And of course, we are talking about a time in history in Japan and specific generals during that time. So there is a little bit of a specific knowledge area that you might be hopefully sparking some curiosity or motivating kids to do some reading or some research about that time in that place in the world, or about those people who are listed on those cards. And I find that, Japanese history I find really fascinating. So it is one extra bonus to this kind of a game. Final thoughts about Daimyo Senso. Well, like you've heard me say, this is a theme that I love, and this is a game that's thematic. You've got this great big giant board that's a map of Japan, and we are talking about real Japanese generals. So certainly I enjoy that part of it. It's flexible in terms of the way you play. You can choose to play with the action cards. There's some other optional rules in the rule book. You can choose to use the table here if you want to make things a bit more predictable. Plus, you've got those asymmetric surprise cards that you can play, those general cards, which I think adds that element of surprise and allows you to mix things up a little bit in terms of the replayability. If there are downsides to this game, and there are a couple, there are some areas of the board where it's going to be really crowded for a player to try and break through. Some areas of the board are more isolated, and that can allow you to build up your troops before you go into battle. And so I think that balance might be a challenge depending on the number of players. Like what we did, we only had 2 players, so we sort of carefully chose which provinces we would start in to even things out. And I think you could do that even with 3 or 4 players. You may be able to balance things out a little bit. But with 8 players, some folks are going to get stuck in an area of the board where it's really going to be hard for them to accomplish what they want to accomplish. The only other thing is that you've got these soldier pieces, these counters that you're placing on the board. And in some provinces, it's no problem. There's lots of room for you to put those things, and they don't cover up any important information. But in others, they're a lot smaller, and we did often find ourselves having to lift pieces up to see what was underneath, because your movement depends on how many fortresses and castles you control. Your deploy action, the number of soldiers you can deploy, depends on how many cities and castles you control. Your honor at the end of every year depends on the castles and cities and fortresses. So you need to know what's underneath those pieces, and there's not always enough room to carefully place them so that they don't cover up anything important. It might have been nice to have like a colored outline around each province so that you can visualize more easily what's underneath those pieces, especially in the smaller areas where it's hard to avoid covering them up. In a great big province like this one up here, it's not too much trouble to do that. So there are a few things about maybe the board design. The board's a little bit busy, but look, you've got this great big map of Japan, and it's big for a reason. I think it needs to be this big. So I have to thank the folks at Warrior with a Pen for sending this game along. If you are a player who likes area control, risk style games without that element of randomness, but with a few surprises based on those general cards, then this might be a game for you to try. If you have any comments or questions, you can, of course, leave them in the comment section below the video, or you can email me at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will go, and 2 years of previous episodes are up there already. Brains on Games is the Twitter handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, so we're all over the place. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.